The road leading to the town was little more than a cracked ribbon of asphalt, disappearing into the distance beneath a haze of dust and heat. The air was thick with silence, an oppressive, unnatural quiet that swallowed sound. Not a single breeze stirred the skeletal remains of trees lining the road. It had been years since anyone had set foot in this place. A town forgotten by time, abandoned by its people for reasons that no one seemed to remember, or wanted to remember. The buildings loomed as the protagonist approached, leaning precariously like giants on the verge of collapse. Windows, long shattered, stared out like empty eyes, watching with a kind of ominous stillness. Rusting signs swayed gently on broken hinges, and faded advertisements clung to the walls, their messages lost to the decay of time. Graffiti marred every visible surface, though some of it wasn't just rebellious scribbles. There were strange symbols, crude drawings that suggested something darker, something ancient. Warnings, perhaps. Something had happened here. Something that drove everyone away. A journal lay half buried in the dirt, its pages yellowed and brittle. The protagonist picked it up, dusting off the cover, curiosity piqued. The handwriting inside was shaky, the ink smeared as if written in haste. Every 4 hours, the alarm, we couldn't stop it. The words sent a chill through their spine. It was vague, but the weight of the message was clear. Something terrible happened here, and it wasn't over. As they ventured deeper into the town, a sense of being watched crept in, like eyes on the back of their neck. Wildlife was absent, not even the chirp of insects or the distant caw of a crow to break the silence. It was as though the land itself had died along with the town, leaving behind nothing but decay and dread. Each step forward felt like a step into something far worse than an abandoned place, into a trap, maybe. There were no people, no obvious signs of life. But that didn't mean the town was empty. A low hum vibrated through the ground, so subtle at first it was easy to dismiss as imagination. But then it grew, steadily pulsing through the cracked pavement beneath their feet. It was the sound of machinery, faint but unmistakable. Somewhere, deep within the bowels of this place, something still functioned. An old clock tower, its hands frozen in time, loomed in the center of town. Its face cracked and worn, yet the sound of ticking echoed faintly, impossibly. The protagonist paused, unease knotting their stomach as they glanced around, unsure what to expect. Then, without warning, an ear-piercing wail cut through the air, a siren, ancient and distorted, blaring from unseen speakers. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The temperature dropped several degrees, the sky seemed to darken even though the sun still hung in the sky. A shiver of dread crawled up their spine as the air itself felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on the world. The alarm continued, relentless, screaming a warning that was too late to heed. Panic spiked in the protagonist's chest as they scanned the area, instinct screaming at them to find shelter. The town was waking up, whatever cursed thing it was that slumbered here was stirring, and they had just crossed into its realm. Their purpose for being here, the reason they'd come to this forsaken place, was suddenly far less important than survival. They ducked into a nearby building, its door hanging off one hinge, barely held in place. The inside was no better than the outside, dust-covered tables, overturned chairs, and the stale stench of abandonment. But it was a barrier, however flimsy, between them and whatever was coming. Outside, the air had taken on a new quality, sharp, metallic. Eerie sounds began to rise from the silence. Low groans, whispers carried on the wind, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone visible. It was as if the town itself was alive, breathing, preparing for something. The alarm continued, relentless and deafening, signaling the release of hell in this cursed ghost town. Time was up. The moment the siren blared, everything shifted. The ground trembled, a low rumble that grew into a violent shaking, rattling the windows and sending debris tumbling from the rooftops. A gust of wind surged down the empty streets, howling like a wild animal, carrying with it a sharp, acrid scent that burned the back of the protagonist's throat. It was as if the entire town had been yanked from reality and thrust into a twisted version of itself. The sky, once a dull, overcast gray, had darkened unnaturally. Clouds churned above, swirling in chaotic patterns, blotting out the sun with a sickly, pulsing light that bathed everything in a harsh red glow. The protagonist could feel it, the change in the air, the shift in the world around them. This was the hell that had been warned about. It was here, and it was real. They barely had time to react as something shifted in the distance. A shape, moving unnaturally fast, darted through the shadows between the buildings. It was hard to make out, a blur of motion that seemed both solid and intangible, slipping in and out of sight like a mirage. And then, another. And another. They weren't alone. The town was waking up, and it had brought with it something far worse than isolation. Heart pounding, they backed away from the door, instinctively reaching for anything that could be used as a weapon. The nearest object, a rusted pipe, was cold and heavy in their hand, but it felt useless against whatever was coming. The shadows outside lengthened, creeping closer, twisting and writhing as if alive. Eyes, red, glowing, hungry, emerged from the dark, focusing on them. Predators. The wind intensified, swirling debris into the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. The creatures, whatever they were, moved closer, their forms more defined now. They were humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs too long, their faces stretched into grotesque mockeries of human features. And they were fast. Too fast. Panic shot through them. There was no time to think, only to act. They bolted toward the back of the building, searching desperately for an escape route. The creatures were on them, their footsteps heavy, relentless, closing the gap. A window, half shattered but wide enough, caught their eye. With a burst of adrenaline, they dove through it, the glass slicing at their clothes and skin, but there was no time to care. The street outside was chaos. The wind tore at them, pulling at their clothes, pushing them off balance. More of the creatures roamed the streets, their eyes gleaming with that same eerie hunger, drawn to the movement, to the sound of their rapid breathing. Every direction seemed like a dead end, every alley a trap waiting to be sprung. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to hesitate. Their legs burned as they sprinted down the street, the creatures following close behind, moving with unnatural grace despite their monstrous appearance. Each breath felt like fire in their lungs, the cold air searing as they pushed themselves harder, faster. Just ahead, a door. Rusted metal, half off its hinges, but it was something. A chance. With one final burst of energy, they slammed into the door, forcing it open just enough to slip inside before pulling it shut behind them. The creatures slammed into the door a second later, their shrieks muffled by the thick metal, but it held, barely. They collapsed against the wall, heart hammering, chest heaving as the sound of scraping claws and guttural growls filled the small space. For what felt like an eternity, the creatures scratched at the door, testing its strength, trying to find a way in. But slowly, one by one, they faded back into the shadows, as if some unseen force had called them away. The town fell silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the quiet before the next wave. As their breathing slowed, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This was the first wave, just one of many. And they'd barely survived. There was no telling how much worse it would get, or if they could survive another. The journal's words echoed in their mind, every 4 hours. This town wasn't just haunted. It was cursed, caught in a loop that brought hell to its doorstep every few hours, and it wasn't going to stop. They had 4 hours to prepare for the next wave, 4 hours to figure out what to do, or die trying. They looked around the room, their eyes falling on more remnants of the town's former inhabitants. A map, crudely drawn on the wall in chalk, marking certain buildings and paths, as if someone had tried to chart out a safe route. A scattered pile of supplies, hastily abandoned, suggested someone else had tried to survive here before. Maybe they hadn't made it, but their attempts were now the protagonist's best chance. But the real question gnawed at them, why every 4 hours? What was the source of this nightmare? They didn't have answers, but one thing was clear, the clock was ticking. The clock was their enemy now. Every tick brought them closer to another wave, another descent into madness. It wasn't enough to simply survive, there had to be a way to beat it. The realization settled heavily on their mind. The only chance of making it out of here was to learn the rules of the nightmare unfolding around them. It wasn't chaos, not entirely. There was a pattern, a cycle, and if they could understand it, maybe they could outlast it. The first thing they noticed was the timing. Exactly 4 hours after their arrival, the town had turned into a living nightmare. There had to be a reason for that. In the journal they'd found, there were scattered references to the alarm and the cycle. People who had been here before must have tried to make sense of it too. The key was figuring out why it happened, and what triggered it. They turned back to the map, chalked out on the wall of their temporary refuge. It was crude, but detailed enough to show a layout of the town with certain areas marked, some with exclamation points, others with what looked like symbols or numbers. It was a clue, at least. Someone else had been tracking the events. Their eyes traced the paths and marks, trying to make sense of it. One building in particular stood out, circled in bold chalk. The notes beside it read, "Safe," with a question mark. That would be the next destination. But they couldn't just rush in without a plan. As they scoured the room, more remnants of previous survivors surfaced. A half-functional radio, silent but still blinking with the faintest sign of life. It was ancient, but might still work. A worn-down watch, the hands frozen at 3:58. A small, scattered pile of rations, as if abandoned in haste. It all told a story. People had been here before, and some had lasted longer than others. The watch caught their eye, the frozen hands a chilling reminder of just how precise the cycle was. The creatures came every 4 hours, but there had to be a reason for that. Maybe it wasn't random at all. With no time to waste, they wound the watch, syncing it with the current time. 3 hours until the next wave. The town was quiet again, deceptively so, and that was what unnerved them most. The peaceful lulls were the worst part because they knew what came next. The town itself offered more clues. As they moved cautiously from building to building, they began to see it, marks left behind by others. Symbols carved into doorframes, small traps rigged in alleyways, places where survivors had tried to make a stand. It wasn't random, these people had tried to fight back. Some of the traps were crude, but effective, tripwires, makeshift barricades, warnings etched into the ground about where not to go when the next wave came. One of the traps, a snare that had been cleverly hidden in a pile of rubble, looked like it had worked. Whatever it had caught was long gone, but it gave the protagonist an idea. These weren't mindless creatures. They could be stopped, even if just momentarily. The key was outlasting the wave, not fighting it head-on. They gathered what they could, pieces of broken furniture, loose metal, anything that could be used to block a door or trip one of those things when it came hunting again. They had no illusions about being able to stop the creatures completely, but slowing them down could buy time. And time, in this place, was everything. As they worked, the countdown loomed ever closer. The weight of each passing minute pressed down on them, a constant reminder that the next wave was inevitable. They had roughly 2 hours now, and the tension was building. The whole town seemed to breathe with the anticipation of the coming storm. Another piece of the puzzle revealed itself in the form of a scratched-up notebook they found buried in a drawer. The handwriting was barely legible, but a few key phrases stood out. They always come from the north, and the alarm is the key. The alarm, there had to be something more to it than just a warning. Maybe it was part of the mechanism that triggered the release, or maybe it was a countdown itself. They didn't know yet, but it was another piece of information that fit into the larger mystery. The protagonists set the traps carefully, working quickly. They positioned themselves strategically, making sure they had a clear route to the building marked as safe on the map. They had no idea if it truly was safe, but it was their best shot. As they worked, they kept one eye on the watch, the seconds ticking down with maddening precision. 1 hour left. Every noise, every distant creak, felt amplified now. The air felt thicker, charged with the anticipation of what was coming. Their body was tense, muscles coiled, ready to run at the first sign of movement. They'd learned enough to know that staying still wasn't an option. You couldn't wait out this storm. You had to be smarter than it, faster. With 30 minutes left, they made their way to the circled building, ducking through alleys and avoiding the main streets. It was quiet now, but that was how it always started. The real nightmare wouldn't come until the alarm sounded again. This time, they'd be ready. They had to be. 4 hours wasn't just a countdown, it was a rhythm, and they were starting to learn the beat. The clock struck 4 hours again, and with it came a silence that was heavier than the last. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, the protagonist hoped, that maybe it wouldn't happen this time. Maybe they'd miscalculated, maybe the next wave wouldn't come. But then, the alarm sounded, louder, more distorted than before, cutting through the oppressive stillness with a high-pitched wail that made their ears ring. The ground vibrated beneath their feet. This time, it wasn't a gentle tremor, it was a violent quake that sent cracks snaking through the streets and knocked loose debris from the rooftops. The town wasn't just waking up. It was tearing itself apart. From their position inside the marked safe building, they braced themselves, gripping the nearest solid object as the walls seemed to groan and buckle. The faint hope that this place was a refuge quickly dissolved. Safe was a relative term. The structure was falling apart around them, and outside, the sound of the approaching nightmare grew louder. The creatures were back, but there was something different about them this time. Something worse. They peeked out through a crack in the door, heart pounding as shadows shifted in the blood-red light outside. What had once been humanoid figures were now grotesque, towering monstrosities. Their limbs were elongated, stretched beyond any human proportions, and their movements were jerky, almost mechanical. Their eyes, those burning red orbs, seemed larger, more focused, scanning the streets with a predatory intent that made the protagonist's skin crawl. But it wasn't just the creatures. The town itself had changed. The buildings seemed to warp and twist, their angles all wrong, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of whatever curse hung over this place. Streets that had been clear before now ended in dead ends, or worse, looped back into themselves in impossible ways. The safe routes they'd planned were now useless. There was no escaping the town this time. The sound of scraping claws drew closer, and they realized they had no choice but to move. Staying hidden wouldn't work now, the creatures were smarter, more relentless. They would find them eventually. The traps they had set before were a small comfort, but they knew they wouldn't be enough. With a deep breath, they pushed open the door just enough to slip out, moving quickly and quietly, keeping low to the ground. The creatures stalked the streets, their movements erratic but purposeful, as if they were searching for something specific. The protagonist knew that something was them. They moved from building to building, using the limited cover available, but it felt like the walls were closing in on them. The town's layout had shifted, and they couldn't trust their memory anymore. The path they thought would lead them to the edge of town now veered sharply into an alley that didn't exist before. It was as if the town itself was working against them, trying to trap them in its nightmare. A creature passed by, mere feet away, its hulking form casting a massive shadow that swallowed the protagonist's hiding spot. They held their breath, frozen, waiting for the thing to move on. Every second stretched into an eternity, the sound of their heartbeat loud in their ears. Finally, the creature lumbered forward, its footsteps fading into the distance. They moved again, faster now, knowing they couldn't afford to wait for long. The window between waves wasn't just about surviving, it was about gathering information, finding something that could help them break the cycle. And right now, time was running out. As they rounded a corner, the ground beneath them gave way. The street cracked open, jagged fissures splitting the asphalt and swallowing anything in their path. The protagonist barely managed to throw themselves to safety, scrambling away from the crumbling edge as a gaping hole opened up behind them. This wasn't just a threat from the creatures. The entire town was becoming a trap. They picked up speed, pushing their body to its limit, weaving through the shifting streets. The building ahead, once a church, now stood in ruins, but something about it called to them. It was marked on the map they'd found earlier, circled heavily as if it held some kind of importance. With no other option, they sprinted toward it, dodging the growing cracks in the ground and the approaching creatures. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with dust and the scent of decay. But there was something here, something different. A pedestal stood in the center of the room, cracked but still intact, and on it rested a strange, old device. It was mechanical, like a pocket watch, but far more intricate, with dials and gears that spun in ways that defied logic. It pulsed faintly, the same eerie red light that filled the town seeming to emanate from its center. They didn't know what it was, but instinct told them it was important. Maybe this was the key to the town's curse, to the endless cycle of horror that played out every 4 hours. But before they could investigate further, a deafening crash echoed through the church, and the creatures were on them again, drawn to the disturbance. There was no time to think. Grabbing the device, they bolted toward the nearest exit, diving through the shattered remains of a stained glass window as the walls of the church began to collapse behind them. The creatures followed, relentless in their pursuit. But this time, the protagonist wasn't just running, they had something that might turn the tide. They made it to a nearby alley, heart racing, as the next wave of hell finally began to recede. The creatures, still clawing and screeching, faded into the shadows once more, leaving the town in its unnatural, suffocating quiet. They collapsed against the wall, breathing hard, clutching the strange device to their chest. Barely alive. Exhausted. But not beaten. There was something more to this town, something they hadn't seen before. And now, they had a clue, a piece of the puzzle. They didn't know how to use it yet, but it was something. And in a place like this, anything that wasn't death was a chance at survival. The strange device in their hands hummed softly, its dials spinning erratically. Whatever this thing was, it held the key to the nightmare unraveling around them. They didn't know how, but something inside told them that this was the root of it all, the curse, the creatures, the relentless cycle of terror every 4 hours. The weight of that knowledge settled in their chest, heavier than any fear they'd felt so far. As they studied the intricate mechanics, a sudden clarity washed over them. The markings, the symbols etched into the surface of the device, they were coordinates, a map of sorts. Each dial, each gear seemed to represent a point in time. It wasn't just measuring the cycle, it was controlling it. This thing, ancient yet advanced, had been designed to harness time itself. And someone, or something, had set it in motion long ago. The answer was as clear as it was horrifying: the device was the source of the curse. Whoever had created it had wanted to trap this town in an endless loop of suffering. Perhaps it had been a punishment, or maybe a failed experiment in controlling the fabric of reality. Either way, it was now the protagonist's responsibility to stop it, because no one else was left to try. The ground trembled beneath them again, a reminder that the next wave was approaching. There wasn't much time. The air had grown thick with tension, the oppressive weight of the coming horrors pressing down on them. The creatures would be here soon, stronger and more terrifying than ever before. They could feel it. But this time, they wouldn't just run. They had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it definitely wasn't safe, but it was all they had. The device needed to be destroyed, or at the very least, deactivated. But doing so meant staying in the heart of the town, right where the creatures would be most concentrated during the next wave. They would have to face the hell they'd been avoiding for so long, confront it head-on. It was a risk, but they had no choice. With steady hands, they began adjusting the dials, twisting the gears, trying to decipher the complex mechanism. It resisted them at every turn, the ancient device seemingly alive, fighting against their every move. But they persisted, the determination burning in their chest. This was their only chance. The clock ticked down, closer and closer to zero, signaling the approach of another wave. Suddenly, the device reacted, whirring violently as if sensing its own end. The air around it pulsed with a dark energy, and for a brief moment, the protagonist could feel the presence of something far beyond human comprehension, a malevolent force that had been watching, waiting. It was ancient, older than the town itself, and it did not want to let go of its hold. The creatures, the cycles, the horrors, they were manifestations of this force, bound to the town through the device. Breaking it would mean releasing its grip entirely. It was now or never. The sound of the alarm pierced the air once more, signaling the arrival of the final wave. The creatures surged from the shadows, faster, stronger, more grotesque than before. The ground quaked, and the buildings around them seemed to twist in on themselves, folding into impossible shapes. The entire town was collapsing under the weight of the curse. But they couldn't stop now. They fought their way through the streets, dodging and weaving as the monsters closed in from every side. The traps they had set before barely slowed them down. Each second felt like an eternity, but the protagonist refused to give up. They had come too far to fail now. Finally, they reached the center of town, the place where the streets converged in a circle, the very heart of the curse. The creatures swarmed, their glowing eyes locked onto the protagonist, but they stood their ground. The device was almost ready, the final dial set to its critical point. All that was left was to trigger it. With a deep breath, they slammed their fist down on the central button, forcing the device to power down. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to freeze, as if the town itself was holding its breath. And then, with a deafening crack, the device shattered in their hands, sending a shockwave through the town. The creatures screamed in unison, their forms unraveling like mist in the wind. The red light that had bathed the town for so long flickered and died, replaced by an unnatural calm. The ground stopped shaking, and the twisted buildings slowly began to revert to their normal shapes. The curse, whatever it had been, was broken. The protagonist stood there, breathing hard, surrounded by the eerie silence of the now empty town. The weight of their exhaustion settled in, but there was something else, a sense of triumph, of victory. Against all odds, they had done it. They had broken the cycle. The town was no longer a prison, no longer a place where hell was unleashed every 4 hours. But as they looked down at the shattered remains of the device, a pang of unease crept into their chest. The malevolent force had been bound to this place for so long. Had they truly destroyed it? Or had they simply set it free? There was no time to dwell on it now. The town was quiet, still, as if waiting. The sky above had begun to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the protagonist allowed themselves a moment of peace. They had survived. More than that, they had won. This town, this curse, would claim no more victims. The human spirit had prevailed, and in the end, that was all that mattered. With one last look at the town, they turned and walked toward the horizon, the rising sun at their back.